All right, so I'm going to speak extemporaneously about this topic, and I understand if some of you might put some remarks in the comments that are a little different from what I'm talking about, but I'm going to make a video right now called The Liberal Case for Reelecting Donald Trump, and I want to put the fine print up in bold right away. I by liberal I don't mean in the sense of the being liberal type people or Occupy Democrats where everything FDR did was correct and we need this grand savior to lead the country forever. Which I think, by the way, I think there are people who do think that the same way about Donald Trump as they might have about FDR. But the fact of the matter is that I see it very differently. Liberalism, in the classical sense, is very different from the way that it has started to mean in the United States since FDR came into office in 1932 and advocated for massive government intervention in the economy in the mold of John Maynard Keynes and his perspective on state, the welfare state, and all of those concepts. So, what do I mean by the liberal case? When you're talking about individual liberties, when you're talking about these small areas that suddenly become very important when you have people who are charged for crimes and they need to be able to know that they're not going to be crushed by the unlimited resources of the state, that's where liberal values come into play. It's not as easy to maintain the rights of the individual in societies, whether they are progressive or conservative. Okay, so I would say liberalism is not in the economic sense, it's more in the individual freedom sense. So those of you saying, well, are you saying he's good? Those of you, are you saying pro-choice? No, it has nothing to do with pro-choice. It has nothing to do with pro-life. It has nothing to do with the death penalty. It has nothing to do with any of that. This has to do with the idea that the rights of individuals in the United States will be much, much more protected should Donald Trump remain president than if Joe Biden defeats him in the election or Kamala Harris succeeds Joe Biden in this very short period of time, as some people are predicting. So I want to bring your attention to a number of events that happened during the course of the first term under Donald Trump. And I haven't written anything down, so I'm going to have to struggle a bit to remember sometimes. But the first thing that you have to remember is that Trump did, at the advice of Jared Kushner, and this is something that Kushner has taken a lot of heat for, he did try to ease sentencing requirements, and he did try to get many convicted drug traffickers released from prison for nonviolent offenses, so far as I know. Obviously, if you have some different information, you could put that in the comments. But if you remember Alice Marie Johnson, if you remember, I forget her name, but I think it was her name is like Nicole Wallace King or something, or it doesn't matter. But there have been a number of these people who were, especially in the black community, who were released from prison due to efforts by the Trump administration to ease these criminal conviction statutes and sort of reverse some of the changes that were made during the 1994 crime bill under Bill Clinton, which, by the way, was supported by Joe Biden. So this is empirical fact. It was a bill that was crafted by Joe Biden. It's something that was very much supported by Biden back in the day. Another area that I want people to bear in mind is that with all of the flaws and all of the problems in terms of Yemen and in terms of other commitments overseas and the closeness to Saudi Arabia, some of you probably object to the closeness to Israel and what you see as a neocon foreign policy. Donald Trump is much less of a neocon than any of the presidents since the 1970s. I think the last president to be as non-interventionist as Donald Trump is probably Jimmy Carter, who I would say is more non-interventionist. But you don't have this weakness and lack of resolve that you did see with Carter. So I'm not seeing nations take advantage of the laxity of the Trump administration um, policies. But I would say that you need to keep a perspective here. You do have, I believe, Nancy Pelosi did vote for the Iraq War. Okay, so she, or maybe she, no, I think she did vote against it. So, of the Democratic leaders, I think that she was the only person to vote against the Iraq War. Let me see here, just making sure. So she voted against it, and this is something that people need to really process, is that despite all of that, Nancy Pelosi, she did vote in favor of many continuing resolutions to fund the war. And you also have to be aware that Biden did vote for the war. He made a strong case for invading Iraq. And you also have Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, I believe at the time, did vote for the Iraq War. Let me just make sure here. So yes, he did vote for the Iraq War. I can actually play that in a second. So this is something that people have to understand, that the Democrats have been tools of the neoconservative agenda in not quite the same way as the Republicans, but they have not been very dependable in terms of preventing our troops from being deployed overseas for unnecessary conflicts.
Saddam Hussein is an evil man, a dictator who oppresses his people and flouts the mandate of the international community. While this behavior is reprehensible, it is Hussein's vigorous pursuit of biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons, and his present and future potential support for terrorist acts and organizations that make him a danger to the people.
So yes, he did vote for the Iraq War. And this is something that the Democrats have never been able to explain. Why is it that, despite the fact that there was a vocal opposition within the party against the Iraq War, several of the senior members of the Democratic Party did vote for the war, including Biden, including Chuck Schumer, who were both senators at the time. And that is something that I think they should have been held accountable for. But they didn't, because we, in this country, we allow people to get away with horrible decisions, ones that ruin the lives of tens of thousands of Americans and hundreds of thousands of Iraqis in that case, without excusing whatever Saddam Hussein did, which I'm well aware of. This was something that the two-party system bears blame for. And Donald Trump has vigorously fought against his own party, and in fact, people within his own White House and within his senior staff, to prevent the United States from going to war in Iran and to try to prevent us from going to war in some of these other countries. Yes, there have been slip-ups, and I'm not going to gloss over them. What happened with Syria, the two brief bombing campaigns, I would say that Donald Trump's proper course of action should have been, obviously, to try to broker a peace in the region. I think some of what has happened concerning the Russia collusion deception has prevented that. And that's something I'm going to get to as well. So we've already gone through the criminal justice angles as well as the Iraq war history of Joe Biden and Chuck Schumer, who would be guiding the country, remember, should they both get, should Biden get elected and the Democrats flip the House. It is very easy to see that happening. It's also possible that If Pelosi retires, you're going to have Jim Clyburn, who I believe did support the Iraq War. I'm going to make sure of that too. But you're going to have basically a neoconservative establishment um, controlling the Democratic Party under Joe Biden. And that's something that I think we need to bear in mind. Let me see. Let's just make sure that Jim Clyburn did vote for the Iraq War, because I don't want to say something that was wrong. Um, doesn't really say. So I'm going to leave that judgment up to you. So I'll have to look that up. But you will still have Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden. So no, I don't think the Democratic Party is sincere at all in trying to prevent the United States from going to war. Furthermore, and this is very important, now in the post-Bush era, under President Obama, the Democrats have reversed a lot of their behavior in terms of war and peace. So you did see them intervening in the Middle East, supporting a lot of obviously there's a case to be made about what should have been done about the Arab Spring, but supporting some of the tendencies, especially the Muslim Brotherhood uprisings in Syria and Egypt during the Arab Spring, that did not create a more peaceful region. And then eventually, as part of that larger trend, the Democrats did support an intervention in Libya, which tore the country asunder. They also supported, in not quite the same way, intervention in Yemen. And therefore, the Democrats under Obama, which means the Democrats with Joe Biden as part of the senior leadership, pursued an interventionist policy that was not quite the same as George Bush's, but certainly within the same part of the spectrum, meaning that this is literally one of the most flip floppy parties that you can get. It's one that they despised the war under George Bush, but not enough to really block it, and not enough to really raise hell and prevent it. But they were supposedly against it, right? But then under Barack Obama, they didn't really do much of anything to oppose it. It was almost as if the party had swallowed its tongue on war. So I think that you have to bear that in mind, that whereas you have the possibility of Joe Biden coming back into power and Kamala Harris along with him, you could see a return to the harshest interventionist foreign policy since George Bush. Okay, because Barack Obama, for all of his faults, I don't think that he was. First of all, he did keep the United States out of Syria. He didn't keep them entirely out of Syria because obviously we did not deploy troops there, but there was supplying of weapons and lethal aid to these jihadist rebels. So the the liberal case here is that we need a president that's willing to resist the war hawks. And Joe Biden is not that person. I think Donald Trump is that person. I think he is, he's not doing this necessarily out of just an anti-war perspective. I think in some cases he thinks it's just a huge waste of time. But you do have to recognize that he did not end up going to war in Iran. Came pretty close. He did not end up going to war in Venezuela, and he did come close there too. But I think that the chances of a full-on war are much less under Donald Trump than they are under Joe Biden, and I defy you to prove otherwise. Another related topic to that is the possibility that if Joe Biden were to come into office, the lives of whistleblowers from the Bush and Obama eras would be directly in danger, more in danger than they've ever been before. Or they would never be able to go back to normal. They would never be able to come back to the United States in the case of Edward Snowden. Apparently, in the past day or two, Trump has floated the idea of a pardon for Edward Snowden. I think it's past the time to consider a pardon. I think Edward Snowden is not a perfect figure. I've heard some of his statements, which are ridiculous concerning Obama, forgiving him and not necessarily even forgiving him, like not even mentioning the fact that he was complicit in all of the dirty shenanigans that Snowden had a hand in exposing concerning James Clapper and the collecting of personal information by the NSA, and all of that is Obama's fault, right? It's not all Obama's fault exclusively as a person, but it is his fault as the person who led the country, who had been this warrior against the encroachment of the state and the Patriot Act when he was a senator from Illinois, and before that when he was a state senator from Illinois. And then once he got into office, he completely embraced that type of mentality. And that's really why Edward Snowden did what he did and exposed this unwarranted spying by the NSA. And that's why I think it's really tragic that we don't have any party that's on the side of whistleblowers and transparency and the privacy of the individual. We don't have a truly liberal party in the sense that a party that stands specifically for individual liberty. Okay, I think the Republicans in some cases are more for individual liberty, and then the Democrats in even fewer cases nowadays. But we have to get back to the point where a person like Edward Snowden doesn't have to resort to taking refuge in Russia, of all places, in order to stand for the Fourth Amendment. The idea that you and your communications and your thoughts and your the way that you express yourself to others and what you take interest in are your domain and not the domain of um, you know, some analyst in some office in Maryland, which is what the NSA is, right? So I certainly think that Joe Biden would be a horrible president in terms of that. He did nothing for the rights of the individual in that sense, and much more so, I would say Trump should at some point pardon Julian Assange. I don't know if he can ever say that publicly before the election because Assange played a significant role in the 2016 election. So there would be accusations and everything, but the bottom line is it is the right thing to do to pardon both Assange and Edward Snowden. You can say in your pardon that you don't condone everything that they did, and there's many flaws and many faults in what they did, but that ultimately they don't merit being thrown in prison for exposing the truth, and that in many cases, you know, the damage that they may have done to national security is far less severe than the damage of the crimes that they exposed did to the the national image and the actual national security of the United States. What we were doing in Iraq did not necessarily promote the national security of the United States. It actually, in some ways, created just this feedback loop of destruction, and we're still living through it today, right? We're still living through wars in the Middle East, and we're not going to fix those societies. Those societies, I think, they have to sort themselves out. It's not our prerogative what happens over there. So the last category, of course, is a little bit more connected to what happened with Donald Trump himself and the Russian collusion narrative starting in 2015 and 2016, which is that if Joe Biden or any Democrat were to come back into office, we would be slamming the door shut on exposing some of the worst malfeasance in the history of the American intelligence community, meaning that you had people who, being intelligence officials, very senior intelligence officials, people who are privy to more information than many of us will ever be privileged to ever hear about. People like John Brennan and James Clapper. What they ended up doing was they fabricated evidence, they used fabricated evidence for political purpose in order to stitch up these people, political opponents of their establishment masters, the Obama administration and Hillary Clinton. And this is now documented fact. Over the weekend, Kevin Clinesmith was indicted, and I believe he's going to plead guilty. He was an attorney for the Justice Department who was involved in the prosecution, potential prosecution, I believe it was of either Michael Flynn or Carter Page. But let's take both situations. Michael Flynn, the only accusation the reason that he stood trial and is still standing trial is because the Obama administration did not want the United States to de-escalate tensions with Russia after the 2016 election. They saw this opening where they could prevent Michael Flynn from coming into office and potentially brokering at least a bit of relieving of tensions with Russia. So in order to do that, they took this innocent person and they concocted this ridiculous accusation that he had been collaborating with the Russian government by virtue of the fact that he'd been to an RT dinner, RT being the Russian TV network, Russia Today. They do English broadcasts. Some of their stuff's actually interesting. Some of it's a little less. They also made up this fake affair that he had with this woman named Svetlana Lukhova, who is a Russian-born British citizen, I believe. Never happened. So they were actively making up through an intelligence asset, an American intelligence asset in the UK, Stefan Halper. They were making up rumors about his personal life, rumors about the personal life of a person that he very casually knew. They were making up this relationship with the Russian government that never panned out. There was never any evidence of it. There was never any evidence of any criminal communications or conspiracy between him and the Russian government. They've admitted in court that even to Congress, there have been documents that were produced that showed that the FBI did not believe that Michael Flynn had lied to them about his calls to Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak in December 2016. But despite all of the evidence that they had in their hands that Michael Flynn was not guilty of anything beyond perhaps taking a phone call while he was overseas and not declining to take it from Sergei Kislyak, despite all of that, they still charged him with lying to the FBI, which is not, it's provable that they didn't believe it. It's provable that FBI agents said, well, we don't really think that there is any case here. And it's provable that they closed the actual case only a few days before they decided to maybe bring him up on the Logan Act, maybe have the FBI go over there and interview him and get him to lie. So they crafted this case in order to destroy him. And this type of treatment they could just as easily do, and they probably already do, to people all over the country. So if you are a person who believes in the liberal ideal of, the presumption of innocence and that the state's justice system is about reform and not punishment. It's about preventing crime and not inventing crimes. You can't vote for Joe Biden. You have to vote, and even if you can't bring yourself to vote for Trump, voting for Joe Biden would be a vote for that type of justice system, a punitive justice system, and it's punitive towards crimes that didn't happen. So it's a persecutory justice system. So that's concerning Michael Flynn, and with Carter Page, it's a similar story, a little less known, which is that Carter Page was a consultant on foreign policy for the Trump campaign with a specific focus on Russia. And notwithstanding the fact that he had in the past he'd cooperated with the FBI in order to prevent Russian infiltration because the Russians had attempted to recruit him as an agent. Nevertheless, they pretended that he was some sort of conduit and go-between between the Trump administration and the Russian government, despite the fact that there was no affirmative support for any contact between Carter Page and the Russian government within the Trump campaign. I believe it was even Paul Manafort. I don't remember if this was Paul Manafort or perhaps one of the other Trump um, underlings who shot down the idea of having a sort of behind the scenes communication with Vladimir Putin, which Carter Page had proposed. So the whole notion that Carter Page was some sort of Russian asset and that he was trying to coordinate this big conspiracy to have Russia install its puppet within the Trump administration, they've never produced a shred of evidence towards that. And in fact, the evidence that they had, which they said was that Page had not cooperated with regards to previous FBI investigations of Russian espionage in the United States, it turns out that was false, that Carter Page had actively cooperated. He'd actually reported attempts at Russian infiltration into the United States, and they busted some Russian spy handlers here in the United States, and they were eventually, what happens usually at that point is that the United States requests Russia to withdraw that personnel from the United States. So, and this happened under President Obama. So this behavior, which they did also to some extent with George Papadopoulos, we'll not get into that here, but this idea that you're going to take people who did the best they could to remain within the best confines of both the law and the needs of American national security, and instead try to basically screw them over. That's what you would be voting for if you vote for Joe Biden. So if you take all of those different planks, you have the criminal justice, you have the issue of the Iraq War, what the Democrats' track record on the Iraq War, which at this point they have now, they've become the war party. Okay, if you take their stances on, the whistleblowers, Edward Snowden, and then and Julian Assange, and then finally you have their behavior concerning Russiagate. And I know for some people you'll say, well, this isn't really that big of an issue. Well, it might become an issue soon because this type of behavior, you're seeing more and more people being charged. You see what's happening in Missouri with the Kim Gardner charging of what are they called, the McCloskeys, the two people who they came out on their lawn and they tried to get these people. They're waving weapons and saying, hey, you can't come in here, you violent rioters and everything. They're being charged with I believe it's I don't even remember what the charge is, even though they didn't commit any crimes, even though they were on their own property, defending their own property. So you're seeing the same type of behavior here in the United States, this persecutory behavior. It's not in line with liberal values. It should concern everyone. I think that there are many liberals out there and many progressives even, okay? And this is important because if you're a progressive out there, I think that there are progressives out there that do believe in individual liberty. I think that they should explore those ideas much more in depth. We don't have to argue about them today, but you have to realize that any of the people that could come into power on the Democratic side, and at this point it is Biden and Harris, they're going to have their convention this week. They will be basically grand inquisitors. Okay, not so much Biden. I don't think he can grand inquisit himself through his own breakfast, but that's the way the Democratic Party is starting to behave. And that's about it for today. So please like, share, and subscribe. Also subscribe to me on all this other social media. So YouTube, BitChute, Minds.com, Subscribestar, Gab, Library, and Parler. And have an enjoyable Monday.